tengo el placer de presentaros a mi compañero Julián de la Fuente y a Dimitris Charitos, que es la persona encargada de dar esta conferencia. Muchas gracias por estar aquí y le paso la palabra a mi compañero Julián. No sin antes comentaros que todo lo que se os ocurra interesante de la charla y todas las preguntas que queráis hacerle llegar a Dimitris, las podéis poner por Discord o por el chat de Zoom. ¿De acuerdo? Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Alba. Bienvenidos a todas, a todos a esta keynote justo en el Ecuador de este Congreso ISCAR IV en 2021 que estamos celebrando de manera online y que tal vez por eso pues, va a girar en torno a esa cultura digital y a ese cambio social. En la sesión que vamos a tener a continuación tenemos como invitado a Dimitris Charitos. Él es profesor de la Universidad Nacional de Atenas, aparte es director del Departamento de Artes Digitales y de Cine y tiene una larga trayectoria como investigador en proyectos tanto europeos como griegos dirigidos sobre todo al ámbito del diseño y sobre todo y muy especialmente al ámbito de la realidad virtual. Él es de formación arquitecto, aparte de eso es doctor en diseño visual por la Universidad de Glasgow y sobre todo creo que hay que resaltar que aparte de esa actividad académica ha desarrollado una muy importante actividad como artista. Primero como músico y luego posteriormente en la realización de instalaciones audiovisuales y más recientemente dentro de la creación de entornos de realidad virtual. Esa doble faceta como artista y como académico le hace tener una visión privilegiada, sin duda alguna, para ver cuáles son las tendencias hacia las que se dirigen todos estos medios y cuáles pueden ser las posibles vías de diseño, de creación y de evolución que evidentemente las puede interpretar tanto en su faceta de creador como en su faceta de investigador y académico. Para mí es un placer que esté aquí hoy porque tuve la oportunidad de compartir con él una estancia muy breve, eso sí, en Atenas y me abrió los brazos sin duda alguna y me hizo aprender muchísimo y compartir con él muy buenos momentos y me gustaría que todos los participantes de este congreso pues, puedan disfrutar también de esa experiencia con él. No añado nada más, espero que disfrutéis y sobre todo, y como os ha dicho ya Iris, cualquier duda, cualquier pregunta la podéis ir reflejando a través del chat o reservándola luego para levantar el brazo y poder seguir hablando con él. Os dejo con Dimitris Charitos.
Well, many thanks, Julian, for these nice words and your introduction. And many thanks to Julian and Pilar and all the organizers of the conference for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be at your event in the company of great presentations and very important speakers. And I'm really happy to be here. I wish I was there, actually. But yeah, I guess we will do it another time and be together face-to-face and collaborate and coexist. I guess this very difficult situation that we are all going through all over the world with the pandemic has brought forward the telepresence aspect of our lives, which has been around for so many years and decades. However, it's become a very integral part, a very central part of our everyday life and work and social life in the last year or in the last 14 months, I guess. So some of the issues I will talk about today are becoming more and more relevant. So in the last year, we're getting more and more new ideas for research, some of which we have started to work on. However, I'll take you back some years before that, I guess. I thought I would present some earlier parts of my work, like back in the 90s, which I believe are still relevant. And then I will focus a little bit more on the work I have been doing in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. So let me share the presentation for a second, and then I'll start talking. And of course, please ask any questions when we finish with this presentation. Right, is the presentation visible? Is it okay? Can you see it?
Perfect.
Yeah, excellent. So, virtual environments have been around for many years. Virtual reality is not a new technology. It started back in the 60s, and before Ivan Sutherland, who's really the inventor of virtual reality, there were people like Morton Heilig who talked about multisensory synthetic experiences that could afford telepresence in distance, that is coexistence between people. But really the person who actually invented, let's say, virtual reality is Ivan Sutherland, who introduced the basic idea, the basic concept about interactive 3D graphics, as well as some hardware. He created some hardware like the first head-mounted display attached to electromechanical sensor so that it could measure the movement of the head and trigger the presentation of 3D graphics. Of course, in the 60s, the technology was not mature enough to present a convincing representation that would look like a three-dimensional space. It took a little less than 20 years for the technology of interactive 3D graphics to mature. So at the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s, we had really the birth of virtual reality technology in several American and British, mainly, research centers. So if I take you back to this slide, what I consider as a definition of virtual reality is an interactive multisensory experience that takes place within a representation of a three-dimensional environment, which is constructed mainly by 3D computer graphics. And this should afford free navigation, should mainly afford free navigation and interaction, because there's interactive 3D graphical environments which do not allow you to go anywhere. Yeah, I think a virtual environment should allow you to walk or fly around in many ways, should give you some freedom to navigate the space, and should afford some ways of interacting with elements of this representation and the content that may be embedded there. And I stick to the original definition of cyberspace, as Gibson referred to it in his novel, The Neuromancer. I don't like to consider the internet as cyberspace, personally. I think cyberspace is a multi-user virtual reality experience, as William Gibson talked about it back in the 80s when he wrote Neuromancer. And so virtual reality technology starts sometime at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. And I consider this as the first wave of virtual reality technology. Environments would look something like that. Yeah, that's a high-tech environment at the beginning of the 90s. It's an immersive simulator, driving simulator, and you see how childish and really rough the 3D graphics are. And of course, I should not fail to mention that the roots of virtual reality technology are simulation experiences and education, actually doing, learning by doing, yeah? And doing things like flying or driving some particular vehicles, yeah. And so simulators were actually the roots of this technology, and the scientific attempt to make simulators was the main driving force behind virtual reality technology. So education and virtual reality were right there at the beginning, yeah. that's why education is a very important sector of applications of virtual reality, we would say. So that was the beginning of this technology. And I consider that this era lasted at some time until the beginning of 2005, maybe. There was some point at the beginning of the decade of 2000 that somehow people lost interest in virtual reality. I suppose this was mainly due to the fact that there were great expectations for this technology, and I would blame the media for that. You know, whenever a new technology appears, you know, the media would make the more extreme descriptions and create these huge expectations, which are pretty much unrealistic. So the technology was not ready to fulfill these expectations. So, and you know, scientific research is also driven by you know, how a technology provides results and provides answers to these expectations. So somehow the beginning of the 2000 decade, virtual reality was less funded than it used to be back in the 90s. And many people lost interest in virtual reality. They thought it had failed or something. And so we saw technologies which are relative to virtual reality, like augmented or mixed reality, maybe getting more funding and achieving some interesting results in research conducted in this decade. And it was only when, in the middle of the previous decade, sometime in 2013, we saw some very good and cheap hardware appearing. And you probably, many of you know the Oculus Rift headset, head-mounted display, that actually brought back virtual reality. So the technology matured, hardware became more affordable, and software also matured. You know, back in the 90s, when we wanted to offer a virtual reality application, we had to either program everything from scratch using OpenGL or something, or we had to buy some very specific software, proprietary software, which would help us, give us the tools to author such an application. I refer to software like Superscape, Sensate, WorldUp, things like that. They all died within less than 10 years. All these companies ceased to exist sometime at the end of the 90s. And that was a big problem because we worked on this software and there was no support for it. So there's many applications that we created back then that we have to rebuild now with new tools in order to get them going and to see them and experiment with them. That was a problem. However, the good thing is that right now there's very good software, which actually comes from game engines. Game engines matured so much that they became virtual reality authoring software in the best possible manner. So that's what we use now. And it's very good, and so we're at some point in the middle of the last decade. The software was there, the hardware was there, so the technology came back and made people interested about what they can do with it, and there was all media coverage and expectations back again in the media about how this technology would become a huge market. But now it was the time had arrived that this technology could become a market. I'm personally not interested at all in whether this technology is commercial or not. But however, I very much understand that when there is a market for such a technology, a media technology, it's very important, because that means that whatever you do can be communicated to many people. And that's interesting, of course. It means that it can be relevant for many people, and it may influence situations, mentalities, attitudes, and so forth. So that was a very, I guess, long introduction, and I have to keep track of time a little bit. So let me start with my presentation. Very quickly, I want to say that I will refer to virtual environments and physical environments as opposed to virtual, because I very much believe that I don't like to call virtual environments non-real, because they are very real. And there's evidence that proves that actually what happens when you use a virtual environment has significant results in the brain. And so to me, that means that the experience that they afford is real, and it has very real consequences, although we do understand that by definition, virtual environments are a form of an illusion, a mediated experience, which is illusory. I don't want to get into detail. These are the experiments that have actually shown of the evidence that the experience of virtual environments does affect the brain and does actually alter the plasticity of the brain if for a prolonged time. Now, designing a virtual environment is a very, very complex process. This is a visualization of a diagram that we are putting together to actually try to understand this process. And this is an ongoing work. It's not finished, of course, and it's not conclusive or anything. We understand that creating a virtual environment experience does involve different stages of analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. And of course, there's many connections between all of these. There's connections between these two, but they're not there yet. Today, I will mainly refer to the design of things, yeah, and less to the development, evaluation, or analysis. However, they are very important, and they're there, and we're working with them in every research project and in our educational efforts towards teaching people how to create these experiences. I will come back to this diagram again later on. And so virtual reality, as I said, starts from attempts to educate people about how to do things in a physical world context, but it has been used for other purposes too. It has been used for creating empathy, for introducing you to an experience which is immersive. And being immersive, it's quite convincing and triggers emotional response for the user who is immersed in such an experience. And for this purpose, it has been used in journalism and in creating audiovisual documentation, documentaries, or narratives for that matter. And that's another example of a very successful example of a panoramic video, a documentary trying to create empathy for immigrants coming from Syria. So virtual reality has been used for introducing you to realistic situations or seemingly realistic situations in order to educate people, in order to get people to feel things, to think about things, to change their attitudes. But what about when we want to create virtual environments which are, and what this means we need to compose 3D graphics forms in order to accommodate human activities. And when these activities don't necessarily relate to the physical world, what happens then? What happens when we don't need to simulate, to imitate our physical surroundings, and we want to compose a virtual environment in a form of a special experience that only exists in our minds, in our imaginations? To be honest, this is the main reason why I got into virtual reality back in the 90s, when I realized what was going on with this technology and what this technology was giving us as a creative medium, really. I really got into it in order to study it, to research and understand how to work with it. Because I quickly understood that this was a platform within which I could basically introduce my two main creative passions. I won't say interests, I'd say passions, which was music, making music, and making space. Yeah, and you know, these two things as artistic forms can only be passions, really. They cannot. But I quickly understood that within virtual environments, I could actually embed both levels of representation, both levels of creative work, and combine them in ways that could create dialogues between sound and space. That's personally why I got into virtual reality. But in this case, creating what you have imagined within a virtual environment doesn't necessarily have to, you don't necessarily have to imitate reality, physical reality for that matter. So if we think about virtual reality as a new form of a medium, as a new medium, or as some people like, I think Frank Bioka was in his book about virtual reality as a communication medium was saying that virtual reality is a media interface. So it is an interface, of course. Virtual reality is a form of an interface. It's an intuitive form of a human-computer interface, and it can interface you as a user to other media. So within a virtual environment, you can have a series of different media embedded and composed within a space or a series of spaces. So it's very important, if we are to work with this medium, to understand what I quickly understood were the intrinsic characteristics. Media have their own characteristics, and you have to experiment and play with extreme or not necessarily extreme examples of designs and developments, and study them in order to understand which are the intrinsic characteristics of this media. I recently came bumped into this new Facebook platform. It's called Horizon. It's been around for quite a few months now. So it's Facebook's attempt to create a multi-user virtual world. I think we were all expecting that, because back in 2015, where Facebook actually bought the company Oculus, we realized that Facebook, being the big company that brings to you social media, if they think they would want to invest in virtual reality, they really want to combine these two. They really want to combine social media with immersion. Now that seemed odd at the beginning. Why? Because I think one of the successful elements of Facebook is that it gives you a very easy to use interface, two-dimensional interface that supports asynchronous communication. Most of the times, asynchronous communication, and this is very handy, because you don't all the time want to communicate synchronously with others. Yeah, whereas multi-user virtual environments are a synchronous form of communication with other people when you're immersed in a representation. However, Facebook has been working for many years now on somehow providing such an environment, such a combination of three-dimensional immersive context, support for multiple users being together at the same time, and I guess something like the functionality of a social medium. Yeah. However, because I'm not really a social scientist, when I see something like that, I quickly focus on the environment. Yeah, and I somehow think that this particular environment is not exactly the ideal representation that me as an adult participant of such an environment would ideally want to be in. Yeah, I think my kids would love that because it looks a bit like Minecraft, but I wouldn't be interested in being in there and communicating. So I'm not saying, I'm pretty sure Facebook has a lot of interesting people and researchers studying this, but I understand why it's very slow in developing something, because what we're talking about here is a very complex issue. I mean, take a look at this, yeah? And these are not all the parameters. These are not all the levels of research work you want to deal with when you are creating virtual environments. And I think that although the technology is here, yeah, I think what we are lacking, as we were lacking that back in the 90s, we're still not far ahead. We still haven't proceeded into actually understanding the intrinsic nature of virtual environments. We haven't gone far enough in doing that, although there's almost 25, almost 30 years have passed since the beginning of this technology, the beginning of the 90s. So I think there's a necessity for actually researching the different aspects of what virtual environments mean as a medium, what possibilities, what potentialities do they afford for us as creators in order to create new experiences of communication within such contexts. And of course, there's so many people that have done that so far, and I'm just very quickly present the very interesting work of artist Shar Davis, who was one of the first to create compelling virtual environment immersive experiences. I haven't put here the work of Marcos Novak, who's a person I admire very much. And he was the other very important person back at the beginning of the 90s who experimented with the creative potential of virtual reality and immersive environments. And, you know, when we refer to virtual environments, of course, there's all different there's a whole spectrum of immersive or semi-immersive experiences that somehow relate interactive 3D graphics with more or less of a representation of the physical world that surrounds the user, yeah. And Milgram's reality virtuality continuum is one of the well-known representations of this spectrum. And personally, I have experimented with interactive 3D graphics, which I think are virtual environments, but of course we have other options too of working with projection-based systems, which do provide a lot of a sense of an immersion visually and auditorily too. These could be multi-projection systems. This is also the full dome, which I'm going to show you later on. And of course, quite often when we hear a successful artwork about virtual reality, this usually refers to panoramic video. I mean, in most cinema festivals that we hear very important directors of our times creating virtual reality, quite often what they do is that they create panoramic video narratives, which are very compelling, I would say most of the times, but they're not exactly virtual reality. Not that this is important, yeah? But I just want to stress that there's a difference from a mediatic perspective between panoramic video and virtual environments. And saying that, I want to say that one of the main interesting aspects of research that I try to pursue lately is how do we combine the two? Yeah, but I'll speak about it a bit later. So what have I been doing about this? I want to present to you now. Now, some of the main directions of my research on designing immersion is that I have studied how to design space and spatial experiences in virtual environments. And in order to do that, I have tried to study the impact that these spatial experiences have for a user in a virtual environment. And I focused mainly on spatial interaction and navigation, orientation within a virtual environment. And at the end, what kind of knowledge, environmental knowledge, that is the memory of space really stays in our brains after we use these environments. Yeah. And this is really the work that I started back in 1993 and 1994 when I started working on virtual environments. And in the decade after, I started working on investigating social interaction in multi-user virtual worlds like Second Life, more recently in Sansar and other such environments. The user experience paradigm, as far as the user interface research is concerned, is something I've been using a lot in the last 15 years or so in order to study the different aspects of creating virtual environments experiences. And I've worked in applications of virtual reality for cultural heritage, for people with special needs, autistic children, for educational simulations and so forth. And more recently, in the previous decade, I worked a little bit more on artistic research in projection-based virtual environments like those afforded in the full dome systems. Now, because my background, as Julian mentioned, my background is in architecture. I studied architecture in the 80s. And so, that stays with you. Your concern about how to compose space is always an ongoing concern, whether I work as an installation artist or as a musician making interactive music. When I started working with virtual environments, my main focus of research is how do we compose space in virtual environments and why? And of course, the first thing I needed to do was to try to understand the characteristics, as I said, of virtual environments, and mainly the characteristics of space in virtual environments. So I came to some original hypotheses that I tested with certain experiments in the 90s. And I very quickly go through some of these characteristics that, for instance, space in a virtual environment is non-contiguous, is not continuous too, yeah? You can teleport from one point to another without having to transverse all the way through, yeah? In general, the principles of physical space can be violated in virtual environments. These principles do not exist unless you program them. So if you don't need to program them, you need to study what you want to program in there. In other words, how much of our physical reality do we need to carry in there? Do we need to carry in there? And I stress that. So that's something I tried to understand with my experiments in the 90s. Because there's no physical constraints that do dictate how we do things in a virtual environment. We do introduce gravity. We do introduce friction if we need it. Yeah. If we don't, then people can fly around. Yeah. Now, a virtual environment also has an issue with scale and scale consistency. And that also relates very much to our own representation of a body, because our sense of space does relate to our body. We continuously compare our bodies to our surroundings in order to perceive and think and understand where we are, where meaning space, our spatial context. So the same goes for virtual environments, but the problem in virtual environments is that we don't have a body, or we may have an avatar. So what kind of avatar we have and how we control this avatar becomes crucial as far as our sense of space in the environment is. And I found that this also relates very much to a sense of scale of an environment, as does relate any kind of a cue within the environment that can let us compare what our surroundings are to things which are familiar to us in terms of scale. Now, I'm maybe talking about it too much, and I need to show you a few more things, but very quickly, I'll take you through my very early work, and I'll make it very quick because I think I spent a lot of time in the introduction. And so what I tried to do with my original research part back in the 90s, I tried to propose a taxonomy of the possible elements of space in a virtual environment. What kind of elements of space does a virtual environment consist of? Yeah, and I tried to hypothesize about the characteristics of these elements. And in order to do that, I studied into literature from the perspective of phenomenology of space, but at the same time, literature relating to environmental cognition. They have very different starting points philosophically, and this could epistemologically be problematic. However, I thought that both areas of literature were very relevant in order for me to understand how people theorize about the experience of space, in order to create the hypothesis before I conduct experiments relating to the experience in virtual environments. Yeah, and of course, all this is based on the hypothesis that when we are first introduced to virtual environments as a new media interface, we carry with us our the way we interact with space in the physical world. Yeah, we can't get rid of that. Yeah, we have developed all through our childhood and up to our adulthood by interacting with physical space and its elements. So some of it stays with us. However, if we stick to that, then we don't really utilize the huge creative potential of virtual environments as a medium. So the whole struggle here is to try to understand how much of this reality, of this characteristics of virtual worlds, of the physical environment and our sense of space in the physical world, do we need where we enter a virtual environment? There's no straightforward response or answer to that, yeah? And methodologically, I think that in any case, whenever you design a new virtual environment, you have to start to start from scratch, and you have to start from the requirements of what you want to do, the requirements of your users, and in order to understand whether you need to be closer to a simulation, or if you can fly away from it and allow yourself to experiment with the creative potential of VR. So I ended up with a hypothesis, a hypothetical framework of what kind of spaces we could find in a virtual environment, and what kind of objects, yeah, would we as designers compose in there in order to allow for these spaces to afford a special experience. And I propose that we could have places, paths, intersections, and domains, meaning places as spaces where we act within them, yeah. There's a certain relationship between inside and outside, which is somehow more or less clearly defined. And so we go there to do things, whereas paths are kinds of spaces which imply movement. When you get in there, you probably want to move rather than stay and do things. And usually paths do have a starting point and a final destination and some sort of things that happen in between. And there's combinations of paths and places which do need intersections, yeah, as spaces of interaction between other elements. And domains are larger compositions of all of these that I referred to before. And in order to compose these kinds of spaces, we use three-dimensional objects that we need to compose and position in virtual space. And this could be landmarks as kind of points of references. And of course, they can be kind of singled out in the context visually or auditorily or in other ways. This could be boundaries, any form of boundary that by virtue of bounding the void does create a certain kind of space, be it a path or a place. Thresholds are things like doors or windows, but because we don't need windows or doors, there's no rain, there's no wind in a virtual environment, but we need some points in space when we know that we have passed from one kind of space to another, yeah? And of course, semiology gets in the picture, yeah? So you have signs, and of course, different theories of semiotics can apply here. But we introduce visual, auditory, or other kinds of elements in there that can mean things. Yeah? So that I'll show you quickly some images from experimental worlds that I used in order to understand which aspect of physical space do we need to carry in these spaces with us? Do we need boundaries? Do we need floors? Do we need walls? Or we don't, yeah? And how some kinds of surfaces may imply movement or get you going, as we say, get you to want to move in there, how easily can you navigate within these worlds when you need to turn around, and all of this, and I stress that, does relate to all interface aspects, and interface aspects are also hardware. So it's very different to actually navigate when you're using a 2D mouse or a 3D mouse, or when you're using your body and a very well-designed interface to move within there just with your body, yeah? I don't want to get into specific experiments, but I want to say that this research that I started back in the 90s has been going on in the previous decade by colleagues of mine too. And so we have worked a little bit more on that. And we have experimented with other kinds of spaces, trying to understand what kind of spatial experience they relate, what kind of emotional response is created for the user. My colleague Haris Rizopoulos has helped me work with that a lot, and his work is very important for this direction. There's a few Greek words left out there, sorry for that. But generally, I wanted to show you the images and the kinds of environments that we have experimented with lately in order to understand how different configurations of space may affect you in a different manner. Yeah. So we have been studied user experience, stressing a lot the emotional aspect of it, of course. In terms of the application of these technologies, one of the first things that I applied my theoretical work on was the design of this museum that I designed back in 1999 and 2000. This was an immersive system. It was running on a Silicon graphics machine. And so I had the chance to implement all my ideas and the results of my PhD work back then into this project. So this was a virtual museum that didn't actually look like a museum. And the idea was that, you know, why do we need a building? Why do we need something that looks like a building? Why don't we work with the main requirements, which is a museological study? Yeah, so we actually did that methodologically. So we worked with the museologists. We embedded content from 10 different museums, 9 museums of the University of Athens and the Cycladic Art Museum. And we use different techniques to create 3D models. We use 3D scanning, we use 3D modeling, we used photogrammetry back then. And then we created different kinds of three-dimensional content. And by following the museological study, I designed the spatial composition to accommodate the presentation of this content in different manners. Unfortunately, you know, the software is obsolete, so the software doesn't run with a 64-bit operating system anymore. So I have to really rebuild this in order to get it going again. Yeah, I can only play it in very old computers that I have, and I wouldn't want to do that for you now because it would be a mess. But I'll show you some images of it. So you see that there's a certain experimentation with transparency or different levels of transparency to allow to show things which are in the background or in the foreground, and to create boundaries which are more or less, as I could say, filtering the visual surroundings, yeah, of where you are in this environment. So in other words, where you don't want to see a lot of the background, you don't need to see it, yeah. So you don't need the transparency. But when you want to navigate, and it's interesting to see an overall picture of what this composition, what this museum complex is like, then it's handy to have more transparency to understand the spatial configuration of where you are and navigate yourself in there, yeah? So, you know, the composition of space has very much to do with how you want to support the user to navigate and view all the content. Now, I'm going to go back to the process of designing a virtual environment, and when you design such an environment, you need to design many different things. You need to design the interaction, so how people interact with objects and with spaces, how people can navigate in these spaces. You need to design the overall user experience, and you need to evaluate frequently in order to understand what the result is. And it's interesting to experiment with how to bridge the immaterial virtual space with elements of the physical space, because our bodies still exist in, I'm sorry about that. Well, that was an analog telephone, so I couldn't switch it up. So, so our bodies exist in physical space when we are in virtual environments. So we need to take this into account when we design the interface. And of course, we need to design content. And what could be content for that? It's 3D graphical objects. It's the spaces within which we can navigate and act and interact. And of course, in there, you can embed text, audio, images, video, multimedia. So the convergence of all of this, it could be a virtual environment. This is an environment that I created back in '99. This was an artistic experiment trying to actually create a navigable musical composition. So my colleague Koti composed a musical composition, and we kind of deconstructed this, and we embedded elements of this in parts of this environment. So as you would move around this environment, you would mix the track, apparently, yeah? So I'll very quickly, I want to show you just less than a minute of a very old video of this experience. It's very low resolution, but I think it's not bad to check it out for a minute. Can you hear the sound?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So as you move about this environment, it's extremely low resolution. Yeah. You go around these spaces, and the element, the tracks of the sound emanate from this particular subspaces. So you go around and you kind of mix the different channels of the track in a way. Yeah. Okay, let's proceed because the quality of the video is horrible. So let's go back to the presentation. And maybe I need to share it with optimized text. Yes, it's better. Okay, so I'll quickly run through some of the images of I'm sorry about that. Of the environment that I just showed you. So here is another issue that I wanted to talk about. How do you compose images or video? Because these right now are images, yeah, but this could be texture mapped video. So, but the video is a representation of 3D space, or it could be an image or a window to another three-dimensional reality. So a very interesting part of my more recent research is exactly this: how can we integrate 3D graphics with video in a composition, and what kind of an experience of space does this create? Also, so I'm taking you now from the end of the 90s to the previous decade, and more recent things I've been doing. And there's a series of artistic installations that I want to quickly show you, and where we focus on this kind of experimentation. So how do we also interact with virtual environments, but not by wearing a head-mounted display? I find that particularly in an artistic context, it's very difficult to actually get people to wear head-mounted displays. I mean, this is very relevant right now. I mean, try getting people to wear head-mounted displays during the pandemic. You can do that, but it's very problematic. So interfaces which are projection-based, they are semi-immersive, they're not very immersive, but can be very relevant. And we have been trying to study how we can create embodied interaction, embodied forms of interaction by getting people to interact with projected virtual environments. So that's an installation we created back in 2016 for an exhibition at the Penaki Museum in Athens. And here we experimented with the composition of three-dimensional objects and two-dimensional photography in order to create these assemblages of different elements. And what the experience of it is like, and I'm going to quickly show you a video of it for a few minutes. This artwork was called This was called Polyspective. So I'm going to share the screen. Here we are. Okay. So you can see that this is actually a virtual environment, but it's projection-based. You can navigate, but you can, by moving your body around, you control these elements here, this three-dimensional element, And this three-dimensional composition in the middle is a bit like it's like a puppet, yeah, that is controlled by these two elements, which are again controlled by your bodily movement. Yeah? So by moving your body, you somehow interact with the overall three-dimensional composition. The sound is also interactive in that the sound emanates from different parts of this object. So by the way you move the object around, you compose different kinds of soundscape that you can hear. And this is actually the sound that you hear here. This was an exhibition that had to do with the city and performance, and we thought that we would want to create an interactive environment that integrated sound and the city, and got the audience to perform, actually, rather than have other performers. So going back to my presentation, I'll quickly take you through some of the work we did back in 2015, 14 and 15 with full dome environments. These are this was a project that we worked with the Department of Digital Arts in Vienna and the University of Plymouth and the SAT full dome in Montreal. And we experimented with creating an interactive, multi-user interactive virtual environment in the dome. And I'll quickly show you a video from this artwork. Yeah. Now this is a full dome. This the good thing creatively with such a space is that it does afford a very immersive experience, but this can be shared by many people. And what we try to do here is to make this interactive for many people too, because quite often when you are immersed in a full dome or in a dome, really there's only one person that guides you through an experience, and all the rest are actually sitting on a chair watching the ride. But that's not the case here, because we could have up to 5 users, up to 5 participants who could hold an object that you will see here. You see here an object that one can actually use to grab parts of this environment, turn them around, and somehow transform the surroundings of the part of the virtual environment. So here you see somebody actually pressing a button and grabbing a part of this virtual environment and moving it around, and thus creating different sounds to not only transforming the object, but also the assemblages that surround you, but also creating and affecting the soundscape of the environment. Now, the soundscape is a mixture of live content played by the musician Alexander Desenonge that we collaborated with, and real-time sounds produced emanating from objects. I'll let you watch that for a few minutes. objects you see here around you are 3D cursors, really. And by moving them about, you can grab elements from the assemblages around you and transform them, yeah? So, I know I'm running out of time, so I really need to rush here and stop this video. And let me quickly go back to the presentation. Recently, I have been working a lot at an educational level on subjects like the aesthetics of virtual environments. And this is some of the work that me and a colleague, Dimitris Charitos, have been doing on the aesthetics of virtual environments. And also on using virtual environments as a platform for conducting experiments on studying social behavior and using virtual reality as an empathy machine, or as getting people to understand the perception of others within such environments. So this is student work on getting people to understand what happens when you get catcalling or some things like that, or on changing the attitudes towards transgender individuals. So we try to use virtual reality as a platform to create, to study human behavior or influence human behavior in a multi-user virtual environment context. Now, before I finish, I very quickly wanted to show you our most recent work, which is an artistic installation that we have conducted in Athens. Now, this is a project that has been going on for a couple of years now. We actually finished that just before the pandemic, and we were about to do the opening, but the pandemic has not allowed us yet to do the opening. That's why we have transferred most of the project online. So this project is called AthSense. Here we interface virtual environments with pervasive and ubiquitous computing technologies. So what we do here is that we have a couple of sensor stations measuring environmental data from the city of Athens, the city center, and so capturing atmospheric pollution and different parameters of it, sound, noise, light, humidity, and so forth. And from this, and we also ask people to get into this mobile device interface and tell us how they feel about their city, and tell us how they feel about what they see, they smell, and they hear. So we get people to act as human sensors, to give us their individual sense, yeah, emotional response to the environment they are at each moment. This is location-based, of course, if people want to share their location. And we also ask them to tell us how they feel textually. Now, all this text is immediately transmitted to this presentation you see here. And all of the rest of the data is used to create this visualization that you see here, yeah? So this is a real-time data visualization of this system in Athens, running since the beginning of 2020. It still runs now. I hope at some point we'll have an opening, yeah, with that. This is what the installation looks like. And this data is visualized in a three-dimensional context in the visualization that you see, which is produced by Unity. And so you can go in the website athsense.gr and check it out live. See the video that I'm going to show you now, which is just a minute video with description of the spaces. There's an audio installation, 6-channel installation, which sonifies the atmospheric data, and from the atmospheric data, the movement of kinetic sculptures is producing a part of the auditory environment. And there's two more pieces, the one with the text that I just mentioned being projected into LED panels in real time, and also a real-time light installation piece. Very quickly, I'll show you this video and I will complete my point. So here people can send their text to the system, and this immediately is transferred to the LED panels over there, and is also transferred to the website live. Now, for some reason, this has stopped running for some reason. Yeah. Anyway, I don't want to take more time. I just want to quickly show you an image of the final part of the installation. But better not. I think it's running a bit slow now. So I'll better complete here. This is a piece that is still running, and we hope that we will work a lot on the data that is being produced to analyze it and produce different kinds of presentations, like visualizations, or study actually what happened during the pandemic because of this data, through this data. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't take too much more time, and I hope that we still have time for some questions.
Tenemos tiempo. Muchísimas gracias, Dimitris Charitos. Un placer haberte tenido aquí en la conferencia ISCAR 2021. Y bueno, pues creo que nos has dejado a todos absolutamente apabullados, ¿no? Con la cantidad de proyectos y sobre todo la profundidad de los mismos, tanto desde el punto de vista de la investigación como de la creación artística. Sin duda alguna nos has abierto los ojos y la mente hacia el mundo de los entornos virtuales. Así que gracias de verdad. Vamos a ir dando, hay bastantes preguntas, la verdad, que nos han ido llegando a través de los diferentes medios del Congreso. Mis compañeras Iris y Alba os van a poder trasladar alguna de ellas.
Sí, bueno, no sé si... Bueno, antes de nada, muchas gracias, Dimitris. Ha sido muy interesante. Y no sé si realmente quieren trasladarla levantando la mano o las comentamos. Antes de trasladarla, sí que no me gustaría quedarme con una pregunta en mente, porque bueno, me ha llamado mucho la atención la idea de trabajar la experiencia de usuario desde la parte emocional, ¿no? Y a la hora de crear un contenido. Y sí que es verdad que muchas veces cuando trabajamos en entornos virtuales y se lanza a las personas pues vivir o tener una experiencia dentro de un entorno virtual, aún todavía no están acostumbrados, y lo primero que reciben es ¿y ahora qué tengo que hacer? Entonces hay falta de dejar ellos mismos vivir su propia experiencia, porque les bloquea un poco más el hecho de pues la falta de conocimiento de tecnología y demás. Entonces mi pregunta es, ¿qué elementos o qué factores a ti te han favorecido a la hora de crear contenido de los entornos virtuales para favorecer esta vivencia de la experiencia y dejarse llevar realmente sin pensar en esta nueva tecnología o que están dentro de un entorno que les bloquee vivir esa experiencia?
First of all, thank you for your very kind and nice words. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I think going quickly to your question, I think in general, virtual reality is a kind of interface that by definition has to be intuitive. So has to be, there's no has to be here, but we generally try to create as much in intuitive interface as possible, meaning that you try to create to design the interface so that the user participant doesn't have to think how they will work with this, doesn't have to think how they will use it. So it's very important to design these elements of the experience, such as how they're going to move about. How do they have to think how to control a 2D mouse in relation to the buttons in the console or things like that? Oh, this is so wrong. They don't have to use things like that. The ideal thing would be that they move around their body. That's why we try to experiment with interfaces which are not so immersive, obviously. When you see a projection, a big projection in front of you, it's not very immersive, but you compromise in order to allow for an interface that is more pleasurable, that people very quickly, without any guidelines, can understand how to use. So for instance, in the perspective installation that I showed you, now this was in an art installation context, the last thing I want to do when I present such a work is to give guidelines. I think guidelines are a very quick proof of a bad design. So you have to design the interface so that people can very quickly grasp how they're going to use it. And then they experiment, they play with it in a playful manner. They can quickly, by getting feedback of what happens when they move their bodies around, they understand what happens, and then they try to do more. And if they struggle more, they may get the satisfaction of understanding even more. I mean, that's usually the case with interactive systems and interactive art, the participants have to invest some time and effort in order to get the reward of getting deeper into the structure and the content of the work, I think. So I think, designing as much of an intuitive interface is a key factor. But obviously, when you do that, you have to start with your requirements and your limitations. And this could be practical. This could be, relating to your users, that, the user group that you refer to. There could be many things that you need to start as limitations, but limitations are good for design. They help us design anything, So I don't know if I answered your question.
Sí, perfectamente. Muchas gracias.
Okay, gracias.
Mientras te enviamos alguna pregunta que hay por aquí por el chat. Un segundito.
Te la podemos traducir si quieres.
Sí.
Habla, como sabes, parte de este congreso forma parte de una asociación de psicología cultural. Entonces, dentro de este ámbito hay un concepto que son las esferas de experiencia. Y en particular hay una autora, Tania Situd, no sé si la conoces, que habla un poco sobre este concepto y lo explica de alguna manera como una forma de imaginación. Bueno, la pregunta de Larissa Kruger viene a decir si en tu trabajo has contado alguna vez con el concepto de imaginación y si lo has podido de alguna manera vincular con esa realidad virtual que creas.
Now, I will respond to this. I'm not sure I will refer to exactly the same thing, but maybe it will be helpful. So there's, firstly, when you compose, particularly in the case of virtual environments which do not need to simulate any reality, then obviously the very big advantage about using this medium is that you can actually provide an experience to your audience of whatever you imagine. So for us, either artists or designers or both, it's a gift, because it can give us the medium to present to people, and not actually only present, but get them to visit the spaces of our imagination. Obviously, this is not a simple thing. How you can achieve actually implementing this is a difficult process, but yeah, that's the interesting part of it, obviously. Now, another thing that may be interesting as a response to this very interesting question is that whenever we is that our experience of space, and I don't remember the name of the researchers who've actually written that, but it doesn't matter. If needed, I can send you an email with the reference. But what they say is that, you know, we always exist in three kinds of spaces. Yeah? One is the space of being together face to face without any media, but obviously this is also mediated. The other is the kind of environment we exist, which is mediated, and this could be through video, television, virtual reality, projections, whatever. And the third one is the space we exist in our heads. Yeah, we always exist in another third kind of space in our heads. Now, when we're in a classroom, and our professor is a very boring one, and we're really bored, we probably are immersed in this space of our imagination even more because our professor doesn't captivate our interest. But, you know, we usually coexist in one or two of these three spaces, yeah? So I don't know if that's, so we do exist in the space of our imagination at all times if we want. And with virtual reality, we can make some of these imagined experiences, we can communicate them to other people too and share them with other people too. I don't want to say we can make them real, because yeah, through this medium, we do provide illusory experience with real consequences in a way, yeah. But I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope it does. Or my perception of how this happens in relation to virtual reality.
Estoy seguro que sí, no me cabe ni la menor duda.
También comenta, Julia, por ejemplo, te pregunta que ¿puede suponerse que el embodiment va a producir una directa empatía? Existen voces, o comenta que existen voces que ponen esta cuestión en duda. ¿Qué opinas al respecto?
I think that immersion can enhance the emotional aspect of an interactive experience. Yeah, I think that the experience of immersive space and of things happening in there does engage you more with the computational part of the experience. Yeah, I mean, I've felt that a lot. I showed you the work of Shar Davis when I first was immersed in this piece, Ephemera. You know, when I had to get out, which was after 30 minutes, I was so sad because I had to get out, you know. It was such an emotionally compelling experience to being there. And it had to do not only with the aesthetics of the piece, because Shar Davis is a great artist, but it had to do also with the very successful interface. Now, so that said, that doesn't mean that this does create empathy, but it may get you to share a bit more of somebody else's world, if that that's kind of clear enough. I mean, when you show somebody a video of what an immigrant camp is like, it's quite different to show them in a panoramic video than it is to show them on a screen, on a cinema screen. It's not a significant difference, but it does exist. Yeah, but I'm not to say that, you know, virtual reality will create empathy. That's not a clear-cut solution. I think it's a richer, more engaging experience that will get you to communicate a situation in a more engaging manner, emotionally engaging manner. Now, whether this will create empathy does not only relate to the medium, it relates to the perceiver and the user too, and how they will respond and how, and their attitudes and their ideologies and several other issues, yeah. So yeah, I don't think it's an easy solution or anything, but it's an interesting medium to communicate a richer experience. In some cases, that might create some empathy, or it might give you it might provide a window into the experience of another that you would otherwise not relate to. I don't know if this answers the question, but so I agree with Julia. I think it was. I agree.
Esto también, bueno, no sé si vas a hablar, Julián, perdona.
No, nada, era simplemente recoger más las preguntas que teníamos también del inicio, un poco hablar sobre los avatars en el mundo virtual. Sí. Quizás un poco centrado en esas experiencias de realidad virtual más centradas en el mundo de los videojuegos. Es verdad que tradicionalmente se ha optado, ¿no?, por el avatar y por esos entornos un poco parecidos, ¿no?, al que comentabas de Facebook Horizon y demás. ¿Crees que dentro del mundo de la realidad virtual se impone el avatar como forma de representación del ser humano? ¿O crees que se va a evolucionar como en los videojuegos hacia propuestas más cinematográficas, más tal vez impersonales, ¿no?, en las que no tenga esa presencia directa, ¿no?, de correlación entre el mundo real y el mundo virtual?
Well, there's some interesting studies that have been conducted, and in relation to what kind of avatars do we want to use when we start getting immersed in these worlds, in multi-user virtual worlds. And there's studies that show that we do basically carry our identities, our social identities with us in there. And there's evidence that show also the contrary. There's no conclusive evidence for what really happens. I think that's a great opportunity to actually study this in a larger scale. Well, when you have the limitations of a computer game, the interesting and pleasant limitations of the computer game, which is the rules, the need to shoot, to run, to do this and all that. That's fun, of course, yeah, for gamers. I'm not a gamer that much myself, but I can see that in my kids when they play. And so you need these roles and these limitations to construct the experience in a manner that is compelling and fun. Yeah. Now, does this mean that it all has to be like that? Obviously not. And the difference between computer game worlds like World of Warcraft or whatever, as opposed to virtual worlds like Second Life, like like Sansar, like AltVR or whatever, that people in these worlds go there to socialize, go there to meet others, go there to do things that they want to do in the physical world, but with people that are not approachable, yeah, that are somewhere else. And they could probably not coexist with them if they were in the same city. Obviously, there's evidence that when you do that, some people do tend to experiment with their identities, with identity switching and changing, and that's also very interesting for. And there's very interesting studies from an anthropological perspective and a psychological and a social psychological perspective. We have started some studies there, but they're kind of small scale studies. But that's a big area, and we really want to get more into that. I don't know if again I answered the question. It's a big issue. what I find very interesting and very relevant for today, for our year of the pandemic, is and that's what actually I'm trying to do this semester with my students in the Department of Digital Arts and Cinema, is that we're trying to see how we can use this multi-user virtual worlds as classes, because Zoom, WebEx, whatever, telepresence is not good enough for laboratory classes. It's terrible. We can't work like that. And I hope that we're not going to keep on working like that. But if we do need to work a bit more on it like that, we're trying to experiment with multi-user virtual worlds to have classes in there, have classes for artistic work, artistic creation in there. Now, this is ongoing. We haven't done that yet. We are doing it now, actually, as we speak. We try to do this in our own server because we don't want to create content for Second Life and for Salsa. Yeah? Our students' work has to exist in our own servers because there's huge issues of copyright there. And I'm not at all happy with how most of these worlds are proprietary platforms. No, I basically responded with many different things that I don't know. Some of it may hopefully answer the colleague's question. I'm not sure, but it's a huge area, and I'm really, really keen on doing research there. We've done something so far, but and also there's a publication that if you want, I can share with you that we published back in the Association of Internet Research Conference in 2018, providing a theoretical framework of how to conduct research on social VR. But we're trying to do that now, and the pandemic is a difficult opportunity for this.
Ya lo creo que sí. Se nos acaba el tiempo, Dimitris. La verdad que es un placer y yo por mi parte me quedaría toda la tarde charlando contigo y seguir aprendiendo, porque creo que efectivamente queda mucho todavía por estudiar y por investigar y no hemos hecho nada más que llegar, ¿no?, al punto cero de uso de todas estas tecnologías. Creo que no queda más que despedirnos porque ya estamos intentando ser muy escrupulosos con el tiempo, ya que hay muchas sesiones y no queremos tampoco que la gente no tenga tiempo pues para entre sesión y sesión, aunque solo sea para descansar un poco. Así que agradecerte, por supuesto, que hayas estado aquí. Agradecer también a mis compañeras Iris y Alba que han llevado a la perfección pues tanto la gestión de las preguntas como todo el apartado un poco por detrás de apoyo. También a la oficina tecnológica David, que sin él no estaríamos ahora pudiendo hablar entre nosotros, y a Vicente que ha traducido gentilmente tus palabras al inglés y las nuestras, o sea, tus palabras al español y las nuestras al inglés, así que un placer. Nos vemos en la siguiente sesión, que será a partir de las 4:30, que vamos a dar continuidad a muchas de estas cuestiones, hablando sobre metaversos. Y además terminamos, ya adelanto, la última sesión de la tarde será también precisamente sobre la creación de estos entornos imaginados con la conferencia de Henry Jenkins. Así que no os perdáis lo que queda de ISCAR por este día. Muchas gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias. Gracias, Dimitris.
Thank you so much. It was a very interesting discussion. Thank you, Julián. Thank you, Pilar. Thank you to your colleagues for helping us with the discussion, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the evening. Thank you so much, guys. Bye.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Dimitris. Un placer.
Gracias.